Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tamiko Brown-Nagin, Dean of the Harvard Radcliffe Institute, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the first installment in our annual series of summer virtual book talks. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to acknowledge members of the Radcliffe Institute Leadership Society and all our annual donors. Your generosity keeps Radcliffe programming free and open to the public, and we thank you. Today, I'm delighted to welcome the writer, poet, and scholar, Clint Smith. Clint is a staff writer at The Atlantic, as well as the author of Counting Descent, which won the 2017 Literary Award for Best Poetry Book from the Black Caucus of the American Library Association and was a finalist for an NAACP Image Award. He is the recipient of numerous distinguished fellowships, and his writing has appeared in publications including The New Yorker, the New York Times Magazine, Poetry, and the Paris Review. Clint also is an alumnus, having earned his PhD in education from Harvard. This afternoon, we'll have the opportunity to discuss Clint's work, including his new book, How the Word is Passed, A Reckoning with the History of Slavery Across America. In this important exploration of history and remembrance, Clint grapples with how we memorialize and understand slavery and its legacies. He takes us through cities, plantations, prisons, cemeteries, museums, and other landmarks, revealing these varied places' connections to and representations of the history of American slavery. The result is a compelling examination of this nation's past and of our willingness to reckon with that past and its powerful influence on the present. We'll begin this afternoon with a brief reading, after which Clint will engage in conversation with Kyera Singleton. Kyera is a PhD candidate in American culture at the University of Michigan and the executive director of the Royall House and Slave Quarters, the home of the largest slaveholding family in Massachusetts and the only known extant separate slave quarters in the northern United States. The Royall family also had significant ties to this university, which feature prominently in our own reckoning with our past under the auspices of the Presidential Initiative on Harvard and the Legacy of Slavery, anchored here at Radcliffe. You can learn more about Harvard and the legacy of slavery on our website. I'm thrilled to have both Clint and Kyera with us today. And following their conversation, we'll turn to audience questions. And you can use the Q&A feature on Zoom to submit your questions at any point during the program. And now it's my pleasure to give the virtual floor to Clint Smith.
Thank you so much, Dean Brown-Nagin. I appreciate that very generous introduction. It's so good to be here with all of you. I was saying, one of the blessings and one of the silver linings of this is that people who are not proximate to Cambridge can join these events, which is an amazing thing that I hope gets to continue after we're out of this iteration of the pandemic. But I also miss, the opportunity to be in person with people. But I'm really glad to be here right now, and I'm excited to soon be in conversation with Kyera and with you all. And so I thought I should also say I'm a bit sniffly. I have a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old who just restarted preschool. And so when they have gone back into the world of all of the non-COVID sniffly, snotty things that you encounter in preschool, and then they bring it back to our house. So we are now being inundated with the preschool sniffles. So if you hear me sort of sniffling or even blowing my nose, I apologize to your Zoom cameras, but we are navigating the re-entry to preschool these days. So I'm going to read a bit from my prologue, and then I'm going to read another section from the book and sort of talk about how that both of these in their own way sort of served as the entry point into the sort of larger story I was attempting to tell. So this is the very beginning of the book, from the prologue. The whole city is a memorial to slavery. Walter Johnson. The sky above the Mississippi River stretched out like a song. The river was still in the windless afternoon, its water a yellowish brown from the sediment it carried across thousands of miles of farmland, cities, and suburbs on its way south. At dusk, the lights of the Crescent City connection, a pair of steel cantilever bridges that cross the river and connect the east and west banks of the city, flickered on. Luminous bulbs ornamented the bridge's steel beams, like congregations of fireflies settling onto the backs of two massive, unbothered creatures. A tugboat made its way downriver, pulling an enormous ship in its wake. The sound of the French Quarter, just behind me, pulsed through the brick sidewalk underfoot. A pop-up brass band blared into the early evening air, its trumpets, trumpets, tubas, and trombones commingling with the delight of a congregating crowd. A young man drummed on a pair of upturned plastic buckets, the drumsticks in his hand moving with speed and dexterity. People gathered for photos along the river's edge, hoping to capture an image of themselves surrounded by a recognizable piece of quintessential New Orleans iconography. After the transatlantic slave trade was outlawed in 1808, about 1 million people were transported from the Upper South to the Lower South. More than 100,000 of them were brought down the Mississippi River and sold in New Orleans. Leon A. Waters came and stood next to me on the riverfront, hands in pockets, lips compressed, overlooking the Mississippi's slow bend between the two shores of the city. I had been introduced to Waters by a group of young Black activists in New Orleans who were part of the organization Take 'Em Down North, whose self-espoused mission is the removal of all symbols of white supremacy in New Orleans as a part of broader push for racial and economic justice. Waters has served as a mentor to many members of the group, and they see him as an elder statesman of their movement and credit him for being central to their political education. Waters is in his late 60s with a graying mustache sitting over his lips. He wore a black sports coat over a gray and white striped shirt with the top button undone. A navy blue tie hung loosely below his unfastened collar and swung over the waistband of his faded blue jeans. A pair of thin-frame rectangular-shaped glasses sat high on the bridge of his nose, the left lens with a slight smudge on the bottom of its corner. His voice was low and unvarying in tone, and he might be mistaken for surly, but his disposition is simply a reflection of the seriousness with which he takes the subject matter he is often discussing, the subject of slavery. We were standing in front of a plaque recently put up by the New Orleans Committee to erect markers on the slave trade, outlining Louisiana's relationship to the transatlantic slave trade. It's doing its job, Waters said of the plaque. All through the day, people come in, they stop, they read, they take pictures. It's another way of educating people to this. And so that's how the book begins. And then I wanted to share another piece, which is an adaptation from a later chapter. And as some of you might know, and as was discussed in the introduction, I'm a poet. And so my thinking around this book is very much animated by my sort of literary training prior to this point being that, about being in the context of poetry. And I think what poetry has done is it allows me to wrestle with a set of questions that I might not necessarily have the answer to. And when I was sort of wrestling with these questions, and questions of memory, questions of slavery, questions of history, poetry was my entry point into how I can sort of wrestle with, and in my own reckoning, with what this history looked like in the context of my own life and around the country. So this is a poem that I wrote 4 years ago when I first started the book, that in many ways served as the sort of centerpiece upon which the book would be built, the foundation, if you will, upon which the book would be built. But also when you're a poet writing nonfiction, sometimes you write a poem and then you turn the stanzas into paragraphs and you turn the line breaks into commas and then you throw it in at the end of your chapter to see if your editor notices or not. So this is also an adaptation of the end of a chapter I have on about one of my trips to a Confederate cemetery. Growing up, the iconography of the Confederacy was an ever-present fixture of my daily life. Every day on the way to school, I passed a statue of P.G.T. Beauregard riding on horseback, his Confederate uniform slung over his shoulder, and his military cap pulled far down over his eyes. As a child, I did not know who P.G.T. Beauregard was. I did not know he was the man who ordered the first attack that opened the Civil War. I did not know he was one of the architects who designed the Confederate battle flag. I did not know he led an army predicated on maintaining the institution of slavery. What I knew is that he looked like so many of the other statues that ornamented the edges of this city, these copper garlands of a past that saw truth as something that should be buried underground and silenced by the soil. After the war, the sons and daughters of the Confederacy reshaped the contours of treason into something they could name as honorable. We call it the lost cause, and it crept its way into textbooks that attempted to cover up a crime that was still unfolding. They told us that Robert E. Lee was an honest man, guilty of nothing but fighting for the state and the people that he loved, that the Southern flag was about heritage and remembering those slain fighting to preserve their way of life. But see, the thing about the lost cause is that it's only lost if you're not actually looking. The thing about heritage is that it's a word that also means I'm ignoring what we did to you. I was taught the Civil War wasn't about slavery, but I was never taught how the declarations of Confederate secession had the promise of human bondage carved into its stone. I was taught that the war was about economics, but I was never taught that in 1860, the 4 million enslaved Black people were worth more than every bank, factory, and railroad combined. I was taught that the Civil War was about states' rights, but I was never taught how the Fugitive Slave Act could care less about a border and spell Georgia and Massachusetts the exact same way. It's easy to look at a flag and call it heritage when you don't see the Black bodies buried behind it. It's easy to look at a statue and call it history when you ignore the laws written in its wake. I come from a city abounding with statues of white men on pedestals and Black children playing beneath them, where we played trumpets and trombones to drown out the Dixie song that still whistled in the wind. In New Orleans, there are over 100 schools, roads, and buildings named for Confederates and slaveholders. Every day, Black children walk into buildings named after people who never wanted them to be there. Every time I return home, I drive on streets named for those who would have wanted me in chains. Go straight for 2 miles on Robert E. Lee, take a left on Jefferson Davis, make the first right on Claiborne. Translation, go straight for 2 miles on the general who slaughtered hundreds of Black soldiers who were trying to surrender. Take a left on the president of the Confederacy who made the torture of Black bodies the cornerstone of his new nation. Make the first right on the man who permitted the heads of rebelling slaves to be put on stakes and spread across the city in order to prevent the others from getting any ideas. What name is there for this sort of violence? What do you call it when the road you walk on is named for those who imagined you under a noose? What do you call it when the roof over your head is named after people who would have wanted the bricks to crush you?
Wow. Thank you so much, Clint, for that, that amazing reading. I am so excited to be in conversation with you. It's an honor to be in conversation with you. Okay. One of my first introductions to you and your work was actually through poetry. So I'm delighted that you chose to read a poem for us, especially one that deals with the iconography of the Confederacy, myths about the Civil War, and also your own exploration about what you were taught or weren't taught about slavery. So I very much so think of you in conversation with people like Natasha Trethewey or Nikki Finney, who kind of weave in personal narrative and history into their poetry. So my first question is going to be about poetry. And I want to ask you, what possibilities of voice and what questions does poetry allow you to explore in relation to writing the histories of Black people, their lives, their triumphs, their failures, and even their deaths, when you can't find much in the actual historical archive?
No, thank you for that beautiful question, and for putting my work in conversation with such remarkable writers. I mean, Nikki and Natasha are heroes, you know, and so I very much appreciate that. You know, I think part of what poetry does is allow you to operate in the imaginative space, right? It does not necessitate a citation. It does not necessitate that you are engaged in the archive in the literal sense necessarily, even though you might be in conversation with the archive. And I think for me, and I kind of alluded to this before, but poetry for me more generally is both the creation of art, but also the mechanism by which I do my best thinking, and is the space through which I do my best sort of exploration of the questions in front of me. And I think that in the tradition of Black literature, in the tradition of Black studies, and the tradition of Black intellectual engagement and discourse, so many of our foremost thinkers and foremost leaders and foremost scholars are people who are also poets, even if they might not necessarily be known for their poetry. And I think, thinking of somebody like Du Bois, Du Bois is not known for his poetry. Some might say that his poetry wasn't even very good. But he, if you read what he says about it, he knew that there was something in that space that was very much a sort of heirloom, if you will, and like an heirloom that is passed down from the oral tradition of our ancestors before we were put on slave ships in the first place, right? And I take that tradition very seriously. I take the oral tradition very seriously. I take the performative tradition very seriously, and those are not mutually exclusive from the creation of literature on a piece of paper or a piece of text. Sometimes for people who come from performance poetry backgrounds, there can ostensibly be this demarcation, right, between the quote unquote the page and the stage. And I think that Black poets across time have rejected that sort of demarcation and rejected the idea that you are supposed to exist in one space or the other. I think of somebody like Frederick Douglass, not necessarily a poet, but somebody who was both a writer, like one of the best writers this country has ever had, but also an orator, also a performer, someone who knew the way that language was also music, how language sort of could exist in your body and how your body could sort of amplify and magnify and complement the words that you were saying. And it, to me, reflects the sort of the stakes of the Black intellectual tradition, which is that we could not afford to only have one means through which to tell our stories, or one genre or one medium, that we had to use everything. And that is part of why Black studies today is this beautiful interdisciplinary space, because it is a recognition that whether it be poetry or sociology or history or nonfiction or novels or a confluence of all of them, or a sort of genre bending interventions in that there are all sorts of ways to tell these stories. There are all sorts of ways to reflect on our lineage and our traditions that should not be confined to a single space. And I think part of what poetry does is allow for, it is in some ways a more amorphous genre, which allows for, in the case for me, like this book is a book of narrative nonfiction, but is only possible because of the poems that I was writing that I realized needed more space to breathe or needed to be in conversation with other people, which ultimately led to it becoming a more extended narrative nonfiction project. But that what the book looks like now is not possible without the poems that came before it.
That makes so much sense. So I want to turn us over to the book. And in the book, you take us on a literal journey through the different places and spaces you write about. The title of the book comes from the first site we as the readers visit with you. Can you tell us about how you arrive at How the Word is Passed as the title?
Yeah. So the first book or the first chapter of the book is about Monticello. And I wanted to go to Monticello because I think that Jefferson sort of embodies the contradictions and the hypocrisy and the cognitive dissonance of this country, in the sense that Jefferson is somebody who wrote one of the most important documents in the history of the Western world, and also is someone who enslaved over 600 people over the course of his lifetime, including 4 of his own children. He wrote in one document that all men are created equal, and wrote in another document that Black people are inferior to whites in both endowments of body and mind. And so he embodies the sort of contradictions and personifies, I think, the contradictions of this country, in that America is a place that has provided unparalleled, unimaginable opportunities for millions of people across generations in ways that their ancestors could have never imagined, but has also done so at the direct expense of millions and millions of other people who have been intergenerationally subjugated and oppressed to create that opportunity for the aforementioned group. And so when I went to Monticello, part of what I'm interested in is like, how does Monticello tell an honest story about who Jefferson is? But also, how does Monticello center the story of Monticello, not singularly on Jefferson, but on the lives of the hundreds of enslaved people who lived there, the Hemmingses, the Fawcett's, the Grangers, and so many others, in many ways who that land belonged to, more than it belonged to Jefferson, right? Like, I mean, they were the people who built the land, who cultivated the land, who made that land possible. And also just functionally, Jefferson was away from Monticello for so much of his life. He was in DC and Paris and New York and Philadelphia in his various positions with the US government. And so it truly, that land really, in terms of like the intimacy of one's relationship to the land, belonged to those families who were there across generations. And RU as an institution, which is dedicated to preserving the legacy of this space, not only of the man who owned the space, but the space itself, telling a full story of that. And I'm one of the things that I love about what Monticello does is they have what's called the Getting Word Oral History Project. And as part of that, they interview the descendants of people who were enslaved at Monticello. And there was a quote when I was going through these sort of testimonies from one of the descendants of an enslaved family. And he was talking about how oral histories passed down over generations were the mechanism by which he knew the stories of his, great grandparents who were enslaved at Monticello. And he said, this is how the word is passed down, talking about these stories, talking about the way that it moved across generations. And I think as a writer, sometimes you have these moments where you like see a passage or you see a sentence and you're like, all right, that's it. Like I see it, and I saw it immediately. I was like, how the word is passed. And so I kind of like, chopped the top and the bottom off. And it just captured so much of what I wanted the book to what I wanted the book to do. And what I hope that it does, and sort of embodied so many of the themes and conceits and ambitions of the project.
Yeah, so one of the things that I also really loved about the way that you take us through these different places is that you really are tracking as well kind of the evolution of how sites themselves have grappled with their history or refused to grapple with their history, as well as how they think about the legacies of slavery today. And so I want to put Monticello, your visit to Monticello, in conversation with your visit to Angola, because you talk about the way in which they're both thinking about a narrative of progress, but vastly different. And so I wanted you to give us a little insight into your tour experience at Monticello and the way that you observed how their tour on slavery could actually impact visitors.
Yeah, I mean, Monticello, again, one of the things that I found about it that's so interesting is that it really represents a place that has evolved, as you alluded to, it so much in the way that it's told the story. So if you go to somebody who went to Monticello 30, 20, even 10 years ago, the way that they experience, and I've had a lot of readers who like went to Monticello a decade or two ago and have said like, oh, I never experienced Monticello in the way that you did. But part of it is because Monticello is a place in the Thomas Jefferson Foundation, which runs Monticello, in my experience and in conversation with the people who lead that work, is pretty responsive to new information and is pretty responsive to a new set of sociopolitical realities, and is always interrogating what their responsibility as an institution is, and as an institution, and perhaps the most famous plantation in the world, right? I mean, it's hard to think of a plantation that is more visited more frequently. I think Monticello has almost half, before the pandemic at least, had 500,000 visitors a year. And so, one of the most famous plantations in the world. And it is, whether it is Annette Gordon-Reed's incredible scholarship, whether it is new DNA evidence about the relationship between Jefferson and Hemings, even when there is pushback and tension within the organization itself, I found that ultimately they end up in a place where they are trying to be a better version of themselves, even if an imperfect version of themselves. And so one of the things that is most interesting, so when I went to Monticello, I got a tour from a guy named David Thorson. And Monticello is interesting because it has multiple tours. There's the main house tour, and then there's a slavery at Monticello tour. There's I think a tour that focuses on his relationship to like gardening or trees or in the natural world. There's a tour now specifically focused on Sally Hemings and the Hemings family. And I was on a tour with a guy named David Thorson, who's the guide. And there was these two women, there were about a dozen people on the tour, and there were these two women who I was watching the entire time. And David, as I described in the book, really gave a sort of masterclass, like a pedagogical masterclass in teaching about who Jefferson was, what his relationship to slavery was, and how it is part of the sort of a microcosm, if you will, of what was happening throughout Virginia, colonial Virginia in that time. And these women who I was watching were clearly really unsettled by so much of what David was sharing. And I went up to them after, two women named Donna and Grace. And I was like, I just basically went up and asked, I'd love to hear what you thought of David's tour. Like, my name's Clint Smith. I'm interested in how people are experiencing these different tours and tour guides. And Donna, I think, said, man, he really took the shine off the guy. He was like, I never knew that Jefferson was an enslaver. I never knew that Jefferson owned enslaved people. I never knew that Monticello was a plantation. And mind you, these are people who got on planes, who rented cars, who got hotel rooms, who came to this site as a sort of pilgrimage to see the home of one of our founding fathers, one of the third president of this country, and had no idea, had no conception of this person being an enslaver and of this place being a plantation. And what it was a reminder to me was that it was a moment in which it provided a level of clarity and an important reminder, especially as I began this project, that there are so many millions of people across this country who do not understand the history of slavery in any way that is commensurate with the actual impact that it had on our history and on our contemporary landscape of inequality. And it was in that moment that I too realized I needed this book to be not just my own reflections and meditations on these places, but in conversation with the experiences of others. And to the latter part of your point, it's hard to say like if Donna and Grace left and like their entire conception of US history changed, or if that was an entry point to them exploring more about things they didn't know. But I do know that these historical sites play a really unique role and have a really unique opportunity to engage people who might not otherwise encounter this information, who might not themselves go pick up a book on the history of slavery. But in a 45-minute tour, you can get somebody who came to see Jefferson's house and provide them with a set of information that really fundamentally recalibrates the way that they understand the history of this country.
Yeah. And so, which I thought was amazing when you would introduce us to not only the guides, but also the other visitors, because it gave us another level of insight. And in many ways, they also become characters that help you move the story along. And so I mentioned Angola because I wanted to think about how they as a prison, but they also have a gift shop and they also have a museum on their site. And they really position themselves as a site of progress, but in a very different way. And it was one of the most challenging spaces for me while reading the book, especially when you were in the gift shop and talking about the commodification of prison labor and thinking like, what does it mean to be able to buy a license plate or a shot glass that has, Angola State Prison, stamped on it. But also the fact that they're unable to really talk about themselves as a plantation. And so I wanted to ask you kind of, how do we grapple with the fact that in many ways Angola is seen as a tourist destination, while at the same time, there is an inability for Angola itself to talk about its history with slavery?
Yeah, I mean, I could have written a whole book about my experience at Angola. And you said it was the most unsettling for you to read about. It was the most unsettling for me to write about. For context for people, Angola is the largest maximum security prison in the country. It is 18,000 acres wide, bigger than the island of Manhattan. It is a place where 75% of the people held there are Black men. Over 70% of them are serving life sentences. And it is built on top of a former plantation. And what I tell folks is that if you were to go to Germany and you have the largest maximum security prison in Germany, and it was built on top of a former concentration camp in which the people held there were disproportionately Jewish, that place would rightfully be a global emblem of anti-Semitism. It will be abhorrent. It will be disgusting. We would never allow a place like that to exist because it would so clearly run counter to all of our moral and ethical sensibilities. And yet here in the United States, we have the largest maximum security prison in the country, in which the vast majority of people are Black men serving life sentences, many of whom were sentenced as children, many of whom were sentenced by non-unanimous juries, which has since been rendered unconstitutional by the Supreme Court of the United States, who work in fields of what used to be a plantation for pennies on the hour, while someone marches over them on horseback with a gun over their shoulder. So when I go to Angola, I'm interested in what are the ways that a history of white supremacy is not only enacting physical violence against Black people's bodies, but also collectively numbing us as a society to certain types of more insidious violence that in another global context would clearly be wildly unacceptable. And what does it mean, to your point, that that place has a gift shop where you can buy shot glasses and baseball caps and sweatshirts and license plates. And, you know, on the coffee mugs, it had the silhouette of a watchtower. And then above and below said Angola, a gated community. So not only are you a place that is not interested in interrogating your relationship to this history and the way that it is physically embodied on the landscape. I mean, literally Black men working in fields while someone watches over them with a gun. But you're almost making a mockery of and belittling the actual lived conditions of the thousands of people who are incarcerated there today in this moment. And so it's interesting because, you know, the guy I call Roger, who was the tour guide, talked about, when I asked him about halfway through the tour if there was going to be any conversation about slavery, the essence of what he said was, you know, this place has a rough history and I can't change that. So we just have to look forward. And then he started talking about, again, all the things that they were doing to that reflected their ostensible progressive ways. And it was, that was, I think, reflective of a thing that happens across the country in all sorts of different contexts, where people are told not to pay attention to this thing that happened before, not to pay attention to history, that history doesn't matter, that it is irrelevant to what we see now, even though we know that it is profoundly relevant in ways that we can see and in ways that are much more subtle. And so often this notion of looking toward the future or making progress is used as a sort of almost weaponized as a means by which to like push back against or erase the harmful parts of a history that very much inform why a place looks the way that it does today in the first place.
Thank you so much for that. I'm going to ask you one more question before we move over to Q&A. And I wanted to turn to New York, actually, your chapter about New York. And in New York, you go on a walking tour about the city's history with slavery and the Underground Railroad. I love this chapter. In your tour guide, I don't know if I'm pronouncing her name correctly, Damaris?
Damaris, yeah.
Damaris, in her insistence that the history of slavery is not just Black history, but world history. And I want to talk about myths in this chapter that you talk about in your chapter. The idea that slavery didn't really exist in the North or was in some way more benevolent. You completely upend that in your discussion of slavery in New York by exploring Black people's experience with slavery under Dutch, British, and American rule. And so I wanted to ask you, why do you believe that this central truth that, you know, slavery did in fact happen in the North, the central truth of American history is still virtually unknown to the broader American public? And then can you talk a bit about how the financial enterprise of slavery in New York, and how banks in the 19th century were intimately linked to the economy of slavery in the South?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was deeply important to make sure that I was including a city, at least one city in the North. And I talked about New York, but I could have talked about Boston. I could have talked about Providence. I could have talked about a whole host of Northern or New England cities that had a deep and profound relationship to the history of slavery in ways that are not always common knowledge, specifically, you know, certainly in our sort of public consciousness and memory. And the thing about New York is that a lot of people don't realize New York was the second largest slave market in the country for a while after Charleston, South Carolina. It is a place where in 1861, on the eve of the Civil War, the mayor of New York City, Fernando Wood, actually proposed that the city secede from the Union alongside the Southern states because New York's social, economic, and political infrastructure was so deeply entangled in the slaveocracy of the South. And that is how committed they were to, so many of them, specifically the political class, was to maintaining a relationship to this history and invested in the success of the Confederacy at the expense of the Union. And I think part of why these stories aren't told is because America tends to like simple binary stories, like black and white, good and bad, and we don't. And it manifests itself in our political discourse today. We talk about red states and blue states and don't, which almost flattens the heterogeneity and plurality that exists within each state or region, right? Like it is, if my home state, Louisiana, is a red state, but in New Orleans itself is like a blue pocket within this sort of larger Red Sea. And that is the same thing with during the Civil War, there was the Union and there was the Confederacy, but there were Union sympathizers in the Confederacy. There were Confederate sympathizers in Union states. So I think always making sure that we are recognizing that sometimes we are told simple stories about things that were in fact profoundly complex and nuanced. And history is often complex and nuanced. There are sort of there can be moral clarity, which is to say, like, slavery was a horrific institution. Like, that's a clear binary. It was bad and not good. But within that, embedded within that, are a whole host of complexities that inform how we understand that. And it was, New York City, I think one of the reasons that chapter is so important and resonates with so many people is in part because folks just don't know. I mean, it is, again, not part of the story we are told. And one of the things I end the chapter on is about the Statue of Liberty, which I think is interesting because I didn't know until I started writing this book that the Statue of Liberty, which was the idea of which was presented to the United States by Edward de la Boulaye, who was a French philosopher and abolitionist. And he imagined that this gift would be given to the United States to celebrate specifically the abolition of slavery at the end of the Civil War. And the original model of the Statue of Liberty actually had Lady Liberty holding broken shackles in her hand. But what happened is that after the Civil War, and in an attempt to get more funding and an attempt to get more buy-in, if you will, from a sort of larger group of people, you couldn't basically offend half of the country by saying, like, this is this great thing, and like, and because the Confederacy was coming back into the country, and the wounds were still fresh, and so basically they backed away from that idea and moved the chains from Lady Liberty's hands and replaced it with a torch and her and the book or the tablet, and then moved it to her feet. But you can only see the broken chains that are sort of like hidden by her feet and underneath her robe from an aerial view. Like, if you're on Liberty Island and you look up, you can't see the chains on her feet, which I think is this like perfect sort of metaphor for the way that the history of slavery is hidden in front of us in plain sight, even when we can't see it, and that you have to work so hard to see these things that are right in front of you. You have to be in a helicopter or an airplane to see the shackles by Lady Liberty's feet, even when you're standing right next to those feet and can't see them. And I think that is the story of this country. I mean, everywhere. Part of what I hope this book does is serve as a catalyst for people to explore the places in their own neighborhoods, in their own communities, in their own cities that have a relationship to this history that may or may not have been acknowledged or may not be very well known, because this book is about a recognition of like our proximity to this history, both our physical proximity in terms of the landscape, but also our temporal proximity, right? My entire life, I was told that history was this thing, or that slavery was this thing that happened a long, long time ago. In elementary school, I basically was made to feel as if it happened when the dinosaurs were around. It was like the dinosaurs, the Flintstones, and slavery. And I think all the time about how the woman who opened the National Museum of African American History and Culture alongside the Obama family in 2016 here in DC was the daughter of an enslaved person, like not the granddaughter or the great granddaughter. The woman in 2016 who rang the bell to signal the opening of the Smithsonian Museum was the daughter of someone born into intergenerational chattel slavery. I just did an NPR show the other day, and a woman called in and talked about how her great grandfather, who she lived with and who in many helped raise her when she was a child, this is an older woman, that he was born into slavery. So there are people who are alive today who love, who know, who were raised by people born into chattel slavery. And so the idea that we would suggest that this history was a long time ago and that it has nothing to do with the contemporary landscape of inequality, that it is not deeply embedded in our social, economic, and political infrastructure to this day, is profoundly morally and intellectually disingenuous.
What a note to end on. So we are going to transition to the Q&A portion of the event. There are a lot of questions in the chat. If you have not submitted your question, please do so now. So because you actually ended on talking about kind of how close we are to the history of today, there's a great audience question about monuments and statues. So I'm going to start there. The audience question is, some people believe that it is better to leave monuments and statues in place with plaques describing the individual's history in relation to slavery as a better solution than removing them. What are your thoughts?
I do not believe that. I think that like the Confederacy, specifically like Confederate statues, are sort of the low hanging fruit of this debate. Like that for me is like the easy thing. Like this is a group of people who seceded from the Union, who were traitors to the country, who raised an army to fight a war predicated on maintaining and expanding the institution of slavery. This is not, and it is not, sometimes the insidiousness of white supremacy is that it attempts to turn an empirical statement into an ideological one, right? So when I say the Confederacy was an army that fought a war predicated on maintaining and expanding the institution of slavery, some might see that as like reflective of an ideological disposition or something, or my political opinion, but it's in fact just grounded in primary source documents. All you have to do is look at the Declarations of Confederate Secession in 1861, where a state like Mississippi says very clearly, our position is thoroughly aligned with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest in the world, right? Like, so they are not vague about why they are seceding from the Union and why the war is about to be fought. They are quite clear about why that is. And so the idea that we would have people on statues in public spaces paid for by taxpayer dollars who lost a war that was fought because they seceded from the country to keep their human property, it just doesn't make any sense. I mean, like, to put it, I mean, that's the PG way I can put it. It's absurd. It is an absurd practice that it was, and these statues were put up with the specific intention of gaslighting the American public, of reinforcing white supremacy in the early 20th century to terrorize Black communities, and to misremember, have the country misremember what these people were, who these people were, and what they fought for. So I think that they should all come down. We can put them in a museum. There are all sorts of elegant, fascinating solutions about where they should go, but they should not be in front of courthouses. They should not be in traffic circles. They should not be in public parks paid for by taxpayer dollars. If you want to put a statue of Robert E. Lee in your backyard, you are more than welcome to do that, right? But like not in a place where we all see it and pay for it in a way that very clearly is meant to venerate them. And I don't buy the idea that they should have that, like putting a plaque on it is going to somehow solve that problem. I think about the Robert E. Lee statue I grew up around in New Orleans. Like nobody's going to look at it. It's a traffic circle. So like putting a plaque on a statue in the middle of the traffic circle, like it was put up to be venerated. And in order for it to not be venerated, it must be taken down. With that said, there are lots of, history is complex. And like there's a conversation happening in my hometown in New Orleans now about like what schools should be renamed, and which, if somebody, maybe they weren't part of the Confederacy, but they said they owned a slave and maybe they manumitted that slave, maybe they didn't, maybe they inherited it and unwillingly, maybe, I mean, there's all sorts of, because there's like Thomas Jefferson, or even beyond Jefferson, there's, there are people like, so you have the Robert E. Lees over here, but you have the Ulysses S. Grant over here, right? And Ulysses S. Grant was a Union general, American president, inherited a slave, and then freed that slave. And so like technically he was an enslaver, was a slave owner at some point of his life, but we also have to be willing to look at nuances and complexities and the historical context of each person's situation and moment. So I say all that to say, I think that whether statues should come up or should come down outside of the context of the Confederacy very much depends on the specific situation. I think local and community input is really important. And these questions manifest themselves in very unique and sort of idiosyncratic ways, depending on where it is. So what the solution is for New Orleans might not be what the solution is for Birmingham, might not be what the solution is for Charlottesville, might not be what the solution is for Louisville or any of these places. So I think you just have to take into consideration all of that. And also we should just think differently about what monuments can and should look like. Like what would it look like, as the historian David Blight talks about, to not have monuments just to people, but to ideas, right? To aspirations, to have things that serve as a reminder of where we have been, but also reminders of where we hope to go. So I think there are a lot of creative ways to think about what monuments can do moving forward.
Great. So a lot of questions. The next question I am going to ask you is, so you talk a lot about sites, especially historic sites, but many academic institutions or also financial institutions are also a part of this history of slavery. How would you recommend that they begin to reckon with that history as well?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to work on giving like not long-winded answers, because I look up, it's been like 7 minutes. So this is my holding myself accountable. I think the first step is obviously to acknowledge what happened to make that institution possible. I mean, that is absolutely the first thing that has to happen. There has to be a institution-wide recognition and public acknowledgement of what the role that slavery played in the conception, in the building, in the sustaining of an institution. And then from there, I think one has to consider the ways that that should be integrated into the curriculum of the institution, and to what way we can make sure that no one graduates from that institution without a really sophisticated understanding of that institution's relationship to the history of slavery or Native genocide, or whatever the case may be. And then I think also that you have to think very carefully about what making amends for that intergenerational harm looks like. And what Georgetown decide, again, part of it depends on the institution, it depends on the local community, it depends on the specific history of each institution. So what Georgetown does might not be what Harvard does, might not be what my alma mater, Davidson College, does, might not be what Tulane University does, might not be what NYU does. I mean, there's all of the different institutions have very specific relationships to this history. So I think acknowledgement, dissemination of information to both the current students and alumni and the broader public, and then thinking about very specific ways to make material amends for that. And what that looks like, I think depends. And there are a lot of people with really good ideas about what that could look like.
So I think thinking about how we talk about slavery, especially in the public consciousness, we've seen several debates emerge around the memorialization and teaching of American slavery. Most recently, we've seen schools and legislatures try to ban the teaching of the 1619 Project. Can you talk about kind of what the political damages and problems might this lack of historical knowledge have created for the collective identity of the country?
Yeah, so I was very fortunate to be included in the 1619 Project. I had a poem in the original version that came out 2 years ago, and have a poem in the book that is coming out this fall. I mean, what's interesting is that the response to the 1619 Project, conversation around critical race theory, all of it is very clearly a response, a fear-based response to people who see what has happened over the past year since George Floyd, over the past several years since the beginning of Black Lives Matter and the different iterations of it over the course of the past several years, and who see a society that is gaining a much more sophisticated understanding of what the history of racism in this country has looked like. I always joke that if you would ask like a random person in the street what redlining was in 2012, they'd be like, is that makeup? Is that lipstick? Like, is that Rihanna's new lipstick line? And now obviously more people have a deeper understanding of how that is reflective of, that is a mechanism by which housing segregation was perpetuated and maintained in a state-sanctioned way. And so I think that more people are developing a better sociological framework, a better lexicon, a better language with which to make sense of why the world around us and why our society looks the way that it does. And a better way of understanding how the reason one community looks one way and another community looks another way is not simply because of the people in those communities, but because of what has been done to those communities generation after generation after generation. And it is, you know, even the process of writing this book for me was really emancipatory. It was really freeing, because when you more intimately learn the history of this country can't lie to you anymore about why it looks the way that it does. The sort of myth of meritocracy, the myth of fairness to everyone, the myth of if you simply work hard, you can get whatever you want in this country, is decimated, and it's shattered because the story has never been that simple. Far from it. And so I think all of what we're seeing is a fear-based response, because they know that more people are developing an understanding that equips them to more fully and critically engage in like why our society looks the way that it does. And that becomes existential for a lot of people, right? Like if you tell them that what they have is not simply because of who they are or what they've done or what their family has done, but is also informed by and shaped by what was taken from other people, or what was given to them and not other people, over the course of generations, then their sense of who they are in relationship to this country, their sense of who they are as American, their sense of even what America means is brought into question. And that is a question of people's like sense of self and their sense of identity and their sense of who they believe, their sense of purpose, like their very personhood. And so when people feel that their personhood and sense of self is threatened, there is going to be like a very strong reaction and response to push back against it, because it is not simply a question of accepting new information. It is a question of, you are telling me that the things that I have used to serve as the foundation from who I understand myself to be in the world are false. They're lies. They're untrue, or they're misleading. They're distorted, and that's scary for a lot of people.
Yeah, so there's another audience question that I think is actually in alignment with what you just said, and it's about reflecting about the Blandford Cemetery. And at the end of the chapter, you ponder, what will it take for people to confront a false history? Do you have any new insights about what will it take now that the book is out and you've completed it? Any new insights you can offer?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think I end that question, that chapter with a question, in part because I'm not sure. I mean, I know that it kind of building on what I was saying, for so many people in this country, they understand history their understanding of history is not based in primary source documents or empirical evidence or historical fact. It is based on a story that they are told. And it is a story that they tell. I think of a guy named Jeff, who I met at the Sons Confederate Veterans Memorial Day celebration that I went to at the Confederate Cemetery. And he's a part of the Sons Confederate organization, Confederate reenactor. And he was telling me about how when he was young, he and his grandfather would come sit in the gazebo in the middle of this cemetery where the remains of 30,000 Confederate soldiers are buried. And they would sit in the gazebo at dusk and they would watch the deer scamper through the tombstones. And his grandfather would sing him these Dixie songs and tell him these stories about how brave these men were who were buried here. And that is something that has stayed with Jeff for a long time. And now Jeff tells the same stories that his grandfather told him to his granddaughters, and takes them to this cemetery and tells them about these people. And so if you were to say, Jeff, the things you told your grandfather was telling you are a lie, again, that's existential for Jeff, right? Because you are not only bringing into question the facts, but like, you're calling my grandfather a liar. You're saying the things that shaped my love, that animate the love I had for my grandfather, are based in a lie. You're saying that the memories associated with how I came to be, how I came to understand myself in the world, are based in a lie. And that's hard for a lot of people. But there are also a lot of people who make a different set of choices. I say, like, what would it look like if Jeff, instead of taking his granddaughters and saying, like, telling his granddaughters the same story that his grandfather told him about these brave men who fought a war that had nothing to do with slavery, and they were just fighting to protect their community in the war of northern aggression, et cetera, et cetera. What if he looked at them and said, the people buried here are your family, and they fought a war for a terrible, terrible thing. And we should acknowledge that, and we shouldn't run from that. But you also don't have to be defined by the decisions that they made. Who you are in the world is not singularly shaped by the decisions that these men, generations who came generations before you, made in their time. You can make a different set of decisions moving forward to make amends for the things that they were attempting to preserve. That's possible, like there are people who do that. The person that I went to the Confederate cemetery with was my friend William, who went with me in part because my wife was not about to let me go to a Sons of Confederate Veterans event by myself, and she was like, "Bring Billy, who's like a white guy who is a good friend of ours." She was like, "You need to go with Billy," and so Billy came. But Billy's also on his own journey of wrestling with the fact that his ancestors owned enslaved people, that they had a plantation in Georgia, that they fought for the Confederate Army, and Billy is like, I'm not defined by the decisions those people made. That's my family, but that's not me. That's not who I am. I don't have to be defined by those choices. And so it's so much of it is shaped by family and community and lineage, in ways that I understand, sort of emotionally, but in ways that we all of us in different ways in our lives have to work to detach ourselves from from being emotionally entangled in things that are harmful, even when it's hard. Like, that's what we have to do. That's what it means to be a human.
Wow. So there are a lot of questions, but I'm going to ask you one last question because a lot of people have asked about your amazing bookshelves. And so I figured we'd end on a fun question: is what book, in addition to your own, would you recommend for people to read right now?
Oh, man. There's so many. On this topic, I mean, so I'll say the model in terms of narrative nonfiction that I used was Evicted by Matthew Desmond. And Matt was on my committee, my dissertation committee, and is like a big brother and dear friend. And this book was just, it won like every award you can win because it's incredible. But also just was, when I thought about what a narrative nonfiction book could do, and what it meant to like try to write a narrative nonfiction book about American history and American life, American society that felt novelistic. This was the model of that. Also, Halfway Home by Reuben Jonathan Miller. I wrote my dissertation on the relationship between education and incarceration. And so I've read a lot of books about mass incarceration and the afterlife of mass incarceration. But this book is one of the best books on prison and the carceral state that I have had the good fortune of reading. He's a sociologist at the University of Chicago, and it's written like a sociological memoir. Like, it's like, because he's not only putting his deep research on the page, but also talking about how his life has been deeply impacted by incarceration and his relationship to his brother, who was incarcerated for extended periods of time. And it's just beautifully written. It has an incredible section at the end about how his proximity to this history does not hinder his ability to tell the story, but actually makes it that his proximity is a gift, as he puts it, right? Like it affords him a unique lens through which to really understand his history. And then this one is actually holding my laptop up, so I'm gonna do like a little switcheroo. This is how you guys know you're at a Zoom event. So we're gonna do that, and I will say that this is the biography of Frederick Douglass by historian David Blight at Yale University. Just like one of maybe the best biography I've ever read in my life. I also am just like a huge Douglass, fan is the right word, but like I admire Douglass and his work and writing so much. And David Blight wrote what ended up being a Pulitzer Prize winning book of history, or a Pulitzer Prize winning biography of Douglass. And it's just extraordinary. I mean, Douglass becomes your sort of the protagonist in the way that I try to lead the reader through a tour of these different historical sites. It feels like Douglass is leading you through like 19th century America. And so this is an amazing book. So those are three that I love and are models of what beautiful historically engaged, socially engaged nonfiction, I think can look like.
Well, thank you so much for those book suggestions, but also for leading us through such a wonderful and engaging and informative conversation. Thank you so much, Clint. We were very lucky to have you today.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for coming. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, so this concludes our program today. I want to thank Clint for his moving reading and thoughtful conversation, and our audience for the terrific questions. Today's program has been recorded and will be posted on the Radcliffe website in about a week. For information on upcoming virtual programs, including the book talk on Tuesday, July 20th, with Taya Miles, author of All That She Carried, The Journey of Ashley Sack, A Black Family Keepsake, and see the videos of past events, please visit radcliffe.harvard.edu. I also encourage you to explore the website of the Royall House and Slave Quarters, royallhouse.org, for additional information about our work. Thank you, everyone, for attending.